Hello everyone, welcome back to Stadium Stats. This week we'll be going over Week 12 of the NFL and going over which teams I think will win and lose each matchup. So, without further ado, let's begin. With our first matchup, we've got an NFC North divisional matchup on the morning of Thanksgiving between the Packers and the Lions. The Lions are coming off a very rough game versus the Bears, where they barely won. They were down 12 points going into the last 4 minutes of the game, ended up coming back and winning. It was a really poor showing by the Lions as they let up a lot of points to the Bears, who have been relatively dysfunctional all season. It was also Justin Fields' first game back, and they still let up a really good game for him, as well as their offense really did not perform, especially in that first half. It was a rough game for the Lions, but they did end up winning. They are now, their record is now 8-2, which is the first time that has happened in almost a century. The Lions are a very good team, but this was a really poor performance. Not a great look for their team as a whole. The Packers, on the other hand, coming off a big win over the Chargers. The Chargers have been a dysfunctional team all year and keep losing these kinds of close games, but I'm not trying to take that away from the Packers. It was a really good game by them. Jordan Love played really well. Aaron Jones did unfortunately get hurt, and the run game has suffered as a result of that. But I don't think this game will be that close anyways. Each of their last few matchups, the Lions have won, and it hasn't been that close. And the Lions are still a much better team than the Packers. So I think the Lions will win this game on Thanksgiving. Lions win. Our next matchup is another divisional matchup between the Cowboys and the Commanders. The Cowboys coming off another big win. They keep beating up on terrible opponents. This time it was the Panthers, who they beat 33-10. The Cowboys continue to look really good against really bad teams and not as good against certain good teams. They're really inconsistent, but they have an incredibly high ceiling. Their defense is really good. Deron Bland now has tied the all-time record for amount of pick sixes in a season with 4, and there's still many weeks to go. That defense is really unstoppable. The Commanders, on the other hand, just lost to the Tommy DeVito-led Giants and let up 3 touchdowns to him. It was a really poor performance by the Commanders' defense and an even worse performance by their offense, who had 6 turnovers. The Commanders, especially after having traded away Sweat and Chase Young, are really not a good team. The Cowboys are a very good team, so I don't see this game being that close either. Cowboys win. Our next matchup is another divisional matchup on Thanksgiving, this time for Thursday Night Football. It's the 49ers taking on the Seattle Seahawks. The Seahawks coming off a heartbreaking last-second loss to the Rams. The Rams were losing the entire game and then came back, and the Seahawks had a chance to beat them with a game-winning field goal, and they missed it. The Seahawks, it shouldn't have even been that close of a game. Cooper Kupp got hurt for the Rams very early on, and yet the Rams still were able to keep it close and eventually win that game. The Seahawks are supposed to be a really good team and now keep playing these teams that they should be beating really close, just like they did with the Commanders last week. It's a really poor showing for the Seahawks. The 49ers, on the other hand, coming off back-to-back wins out of their bye after that 3-game losing streak. They look really, really good. They look like they did at the beginning of the year, where they seemed to be one of the most dominant teams in the NFL. They just beat the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and Brock Purdy had a perfect passer rating. First time that's happened for a 49ers quarterback since 1989's Steve Young and Joe Montana. The 49ers defense also looked really dominant in addition to their offense. That offense was firing completely with all their weapons. Brandon Ayuk had an amazing game. Christian McCaffrey had a great game. George Kittle had a great game. Deebo Samuel had a few big catches. But that defense also looks incredible. Unfortunately, they did lose Talanoa Hufanga to a season-ending torn ACL. However, I do see the Niners winning this game. It will probably be close as it's a divisional matchup between 2 good teams, but the Niners should win. Up next is another divisional matchup, this time on Good Friday, between the Dolphins and the Jets. The Dolphins coming off a win that was arguably a lot closer than it should have been against the Antonio Pierce-led Raiders. The Dolphins only did put up 20 points, which was a little disappointing for a team that was 500 and should have lost big to the Dolphins. However, they did still squeak out a win. Tyreek Hill continues to look incredible. Although I do want to say Jalen Waddle has not looked like he did last year. Yes, he's been injured for a lot of this season, but even in games he's been healthy, he hasn't been as consistently good as he was last year, but I don't think that's going to hold this team back too much. They did unfortunately have to take Devon Achane out of the game really early on because they didn't want to risk his knee injury getting any worse. He hopefully should be back next week. We'll have to see on that. The New York Jets, on the other hand, lost a terrible game to the Buffalo Bills, who beat them 32-6. This game was never close. The Jets' offense is completely dysfunctional. Their defense is top of the line, but with as bad as their offense is, I don't see this team going very far, and the Dolphins are a much, much better team. The Dolphins should get the win here. Up next, we've got our first non-divisional matchup between the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and the Indianapolis Colts. It's our first game for Sunday afternoon. The Colts coming off a bye, very deserved after they've performed a lot better than they were expected to this season. They have had a really good offensive performance in almost every week, excluding the Patriots game where they put up only 10 points. They still did win, but in every other game they put up 20 or more points on offense. Jonathan Taylor finally looking back to form. Josh Downs hopefully will be healthy to really complement Michael Pittman in the passing game. Gardner Minshew hopefully won't turn the ball over too much. Tampa Bay Buccaneers, on the other hand, just lost a really bad game to the San Francisco 49ers. They were not expected to win that game. However, they looked a lot better than maybe expected. Baker Mayfield really didn't look that bad against the 49ers defense, and Rachaad White had another great game. He continues to be really heavily utilized in the passing game. Mike Evans obviously continues to be a great weapon for this Buccaneers offense. But I do think the Colts are a slightly better team. This might be a very close matchup, though, but I think the Colts will win. Up next, we've got a battle of, honestly, a probably tank bowl between the Patriots and the Giants, two of the worst teams in the league. The Patriots are coming off of a bye that was very badly needed, although I don't see it making many changes for this team. This team is completely dysfunctional. Their offense can't do anything. Mac Jones looks horrible, and they keep benching him for Bailey Zappi. They have no receivers. Their running game really can't get going. Their defense, obviously under Bill Belichick, is still a really decent part of that team, but they have plenty of injuries on that defense, and they really do not look like a good team. The Giants, on the other hand, coming off a big win over the Commanders, moving them up to 3 wins on the season. Tommy DeVito, their rookie undrafted quarterback, who was their third string going into the season, actually had a really good game against the Commanders, put up 3 touchdowns, really good passer rating, no interceptions, played really well. If he can play like that again, the Giants should easily beat the Patriots, who are a really bad team. However, I don't see him being that consistent at playing like that. I actually think the Patriots will win this game because I think their defense will be too much for the Giants' offense to handle. Patriots should win this game. Up next, we've got another divisional matchup, and while this was going to be a pretty good game a couple weeks ago, after Joe Burrow suffered an injury, the Cincinnati Bengals versus the Steelers may not be as good of a game as we once would have hoped. The Steelers have yet to outscore an opponent in yards on the entire season in any of their games, yet they still have a winning record, which is really impressive. Mike Tomlin, their head coach, continues to prove just how great of a head coach he is. The Steelers' defense continues to look incredible, but that offense really can't do much. Jaylen Warren did break off a 74-yard touchdown run, but besides that, their offense is really not explosive at all and can't do very much. The Bengals, on the other hand, lost to the Ravens on Thursday Night Football. Joe Burrow, unfortunately, suffered a season-ending injury and will not return. It's a really bad look for them, and I really do think that because Joe Burrow's not going to be out there, that offense will not be able to hold up, and the Steelers should win this because their defense is so dominant. Steelers should win in a divisional matchup here. Up next, we've got another really bad matchup between the Panthers and the Titans. Both teams have been horrible. Both teams coming off really bad losses last week. The Titans, they lost to the Jaguars 14-34. That game was never close at any point, and it's a divisional matchup, so it should have been closer than it really was. The Jaguars were completely dominant over the Titans. Their defense couldn't stop the Jaguars, as the Jaguars had their most complete offensive performance of the entire season. Titans offense also couldn't get anything going, as they only scored 14 points the entire game, and a lot of that came in garbage time. So it's a really not good look for the Titans, but the Panthers have had an even worse outlook. They just lost to the Cowboys by 33-10. The Panthers are now still only have one win on the season. They've looked horrendous the entire year. Honestly, they've looked like a free win for almost any team going into that matchup every single week. Their offense can't do anything. There's not a lot of bright spots on this team. Adam Thielen's their top receiver, who's pretty old, although he is having a really good career year. Bryce Young really can't get a lot going. He looks really like a disappointment of a first overall pick, although we still have to give him more time to see how that pans out. But the Panthers are a really bad football team. Titans also are not very good, but they're better than the Panthers, and therefore they should win this game. Up next, we've got a really interesting divisional matchup between the Jacksonville Jaguars and the Houston Texans. Both teams have looked really good this year, much improved from last year. The Jaguars coming off a big divisional matchup win over the Titans 34-14. Their offense, as I just said, looked the most complete it's looked the entire season. Their defense continues to look really good, as it has in almost every week except against the 49ers. That 49ers loss is the main concern that I have for this Jaguars team, as that was a really devastating loss where they lost big by over 30 points. It was a really poor performance, but they really rebounded heavily against the Titans. I do think the Jaguars are a really good team, but so are the Texans. CJ Stroud has continued to look incredible all season. He did have a bit of a rough performance. He started off really strong against the Cardinals last week, having over 200 yards passing and multiple passing touchdowns with no turnovers in the first half, but then he had 3 turnovers in the second half. Really rough, seeing as he only had 2 turnovers the entire season. But the Texans are still a good team. They barely did beat the Cardinals, which was a little concerning, seeing as the Cardinals are not that good of a team. So I do think the Jaguars are going to beat the Texans here, but I think it'll be a really close matchup. The Texans did beat the Jaguars big in their last showing, so who knows where this will go. It's a divisional matchup, but I think the Jaguars slightly edge out the Texans. Up next, we have another divisional matchup for our final game of the 12 o'clock window on Sunday between the Saints and the Falcons. The Saints coming off a bye, which they very much needed, seeing as Derek Carr had gotten injured in that previous game. In recent weeks, their offense has looked a lot more complete, although they really did struggle against the Vikings up until Jameis Winston took over for Derek Carr, and he only scored in garbage time of that game, which was a bit concerning. But the Saints seem to have had turned their season around previously to that game. That was just a really poor performance against the Vikings. Hopefully Derek Carr will be back for this game, in which case I do think the Saints can be a pretty good team here. Their defense is really good. Their offense can be good. The Falcons, on the other hand, have not been good this year. They keep losing games that they shouldn't be losing. They are also coming off of a bye this week, but they have been losing games, as I said, that they shouldn't be. Bijan Robinson being underutilized. Same with Kyle Pitts and Drake London, both being underutilized. Earlier this season, Desmond Ridder, their starting quarterback, got benched for Taylor Heineke. Really, a lot is not going right for this offense, but their defense is much improved from last year. However, I don't think that's going to be enough to take them to a win here. The Saints should win in a divisional matchup here, which it should reveal a lot about who will win this division. But the Saints should win. They're a much better team. Up next, we've got another divisional matchup for starting off the 3 o'clock window of games. This time it's the Rams taking on the Cardinals. Both teams have been relatively bad this season. Cardinals coming off a loss to the Texans, which they were expected to lose, but they really had a great performance in the second half. They had 3 interceptions off C.J. Stroud, who'd only thrown 2 on the year previous to that game. Their offense looks a lot better with Kyler Murray in, although they're not using Marquise Brown very well as their number 1 receiver. Their really only top receiver is their tight end, Trey McBride, who has looked really good this year. I am concerned, though, with the lack of usage of Marquise Brown, as he should be a weapon that they use a lot more, as he was really dominant last year with Kyler Murray. Hasn't shown that this year. The Rams, on the other hand, coming off a last-second win over the Seahawks, which you could argue they didn't deserve to win, as the Seahawks almost kicked a game-winning field goal. Field goal didn't go in. Unfortunately, the Rams suffered a loss. Suffered the loss of Cooper Kupp to an ankle injury. Hopefully he'll play this week. He's considered day-to-day as of right now. If he plays, the Rams have a much better chance of winning, as that combination of Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp can be really dominant on offense. Their defense hasn't been very good this season. Wasn't expected to be. Not many big names on that defense besides Aaron Donald. I think this will be a close matchup between 2 bad divisional teams, and I actually think the Cardinals will sneak out a win here. I think it'll be pretty close, as both teams can be really bad, but also have flashes on offense. Kyler Murray's return, I think, just will be a little too much for the Rams' defense to handle, and I think the Cardinals will win. Up next, we've got a matchup between the Browns and the Broncos. The Broncos are now on a 4-game win streak after having beaten the Chiefs, the Bills, and the Vikings all in recent weeks. They look much improved from where they were at the beginning of the season, as their defense has improved immensely, especially since that 70-point loss to the Miami Dolphins. Their defense has actually looked really good in recent weeks. Only let up a couple points to the Chiefs, followed it up by only letting up a few points to the Bills, which they beat both of those teams who were supposed to be really good teams going into the season. The Broncos really look improved. Their offense, Courtland Sutton continues to catch touchdowns in almost every game. Russell Wilson looks way better than he did last year. Continues to play as actually one of the top quarterbacks this year. I do think they are a really good team now, who have turned their season around. But the Browns have also been dominant. Their defense has been completely dominant all season, one of the best units in the entire league. Their offense, though, did suffer that loss of Deshaun Watson to a season-ending injury a couple weeks ago, and I don't think Dorian Thompson-Robinson is going to be able to hold this offense afloat. I do think the Broncos should be able to win even with the Browns' stifling defense, as the Broncos' defense can also be really dominant as of late, and their offense is much better than the Browns, who are led by Dorian Thompson-Robinson. So the Broncos should win. Up next, we've got a really good game between the Buffalo Bills and the Philadelphia Eagles. The Bills coming off a major win, much needed over the Jets. They won 32-6, which was very needed after a loss to the Broncos. They finally have a winning record again after having a .500 record halfway through the season. The Bills have not looked like the team that people thought they would be going into the season. They're really inconsistent. Their offense sometimes really performs and other times just doesn't show up at all. Josh Allen continues to be one of the most turnover-prone quarterbacks in the entire league. There's a lot of problems with this team. Their defense has a bunch of injuries, missing a bunch of players to season-ending injuries as well. So it's a really not as complete team as people would have expected going into the season. The Eagles, on the other hand, coming off a very big win over the Kansas City Chiefs on Monday Night Football. This game was really more of a poor performance on the Chiefs' offense than it was on the Eagles. However, the Eagles did play a complete game. Their offense did score a lot in that second half. Their defense held the Chiefs to 0 total points in the entire second half. And while a lot of that came due to Chiefs drops, it was also a lot on the Eagles' defense, who really were able to shut down the Chiefs' receivers and Travis Kelce as well. I do think that the Eagles are a more complete football team than the Bills have been. And while the Bills did have a more complete win last week, it was over a much worse team, and the Eagles just got a win over one of the best teams in the league, being the Kansas City Chiefs. I do think the Eagles will slightly win this game, but it should be pretty close and a very good matchup. Up next, we've got the Kansas City Chiefs taking on the Las Vegas Raiders. The Chiefs, as I was just saying, coming off a loss to the Philadelphia Eagles, in which they had multiple terrible drops from Travis Kelce, from Marquez Valdes-Scantling, from the rest of their receivers. That Chiefs offense really couldn't do much. They scored 0 total points in the entire second half. It was a really poor performance. And while they were up in the first half, they really did end up throwing that game. Patrick Mahomes did play pretty well. It wasn't his fault. But Marquez Valdes-Scantling did drop a huge touchdown to take the game into their own hands right at the end of the game and take the lead. It was a really poor performance by the Chiefs. But on the other hand, the Raiders just lost to the Miami Dolphins. They were able to do a lot better than I think a lot of people would have given them credit for, as the Dolphins tend to be a very explosive team, and this Raiders defense was able to hold the Dolphins to only 20 points, which was pretty impressive. But the Raiders offense really could not hold up. The Dolphins defense looked really good against this Raiders offense, which is saying a lot, seeing as the Dolphins defense has not been that good consistently this year. Aiden O'Connell, their rookie quarterback, did throw multiple interceptions in that game. While it is a divisional matchup, I don't think this game will be very close. The Raiders are a much worse team than the Chiefs, but the Raiders have had new life breathed into them since they fired Josh McDaniels and put Antonio Pierce as their interim head coach. But I do think that the Chiefs are going to be too much for the Raiders to handle, so the Chiefs should win. Up next on Sunday Night Football, we've got the Baltimore Ravens taking on the Los Angeles Chargers. And both teams have been had pretty high expectations going into the season. And while the Ravens have definitely lived up to those expectations, being now the number 1 seed in the entire AFC, they have proven time and time again just how dominant of a team they can be. They had dominant wins over the Lions and Seahawks and back-to-back within very few weeks. And the Ravens are complete both on offense and defense. They have one of the best scoring defenses in the entire league. Their offense is much improved from last year. Unfortunately, they did lose Mark Andrews to a season-ending injury in that game against the Bengals. But the Ravens do look like a complete team. They are the number 1 seed in the AFC. The Chargers, on the other hand, have not lived up to expectations even at all. They are now they have a losing record. They just lost a game to the Packers, who have been a really bad team all season. The Chargers are really being held back by their head coach, Brandon Staley, who is very terrible and should be fired. Everybody, most NFL fans, most Charger fans do agree Brandon Staley's a bad head coach. He's costing them a lot. And while Justin Herbert is playing incredibly, this team cannot win games. The Ravens should easily win this game over a Chargers team that just is really underperforming. And so therefore, the Ravens should win. And then finally, on Monday Night Football, we've got the Chicago Bears taking on the Minnesota Vikings. Both teams coming off heartbreaking losses. The Vikings losing in a last-second game to the Denver Broncos, where Courtland Sutton scored a last-second touchdown and the Vikings could not get into field goal range to take the game. Josh Dobbs has looked really good for this team. They should be getting Justin Jefferson back for this game, but they have been a pretty decent team in recent weeks. I really do think that they can be a good team. It was a heartbreaking loss to the Broncos, but they're an all-around good team. The Broncos are just also on a very long win streak. The Bears, on the other hand, were ahead of the Lions the entire game and ended up throwing within the last few minutes. They had a 2-score lead with less than 5 minutes left and still threw the game. The Bears are not a good football team, and while they have some talent, Justin Fields did play pretty well. DJ Moore obviously playing really well, and that defense has definitely stepped up from the beginning of the season. This is not a complete team. Their coach sucks terribly. He's super terrible. And they threw a game that they very easily should have won over a very good team. The Vikings are a much better team than the Bears, and this game should not be that close. But who knows, since it is a divisional matchup, but the Vikings should win. Now getting into our Week 12 power rankings. In at number 10, I've got the Buffalo Bills. It was really hard putting them on this list. I just didn't know who else to put at number 10. But the Bills, they've shown in certain games that they can be a really complete team. They can score a lot of points. In their first game after firing their offensive coordinator, they did put up 32 and won by 26 points against a division rival. But this team has also shown that in many weeks, they really can just play way worse than expected. And you never really know what you're going to get with the Bills, so it's hard to put them higher than 10. In at number 9, I've got the Denver Broncos. They have the longest current active win streak in the NFL. They started off the season doing absolutely horrible, one of the worst defenses in the entire league, if not the worst by far. But they've really been able to turn things around. Their defense is much improved. Russell Wilson having an incredible season. And this team is winning football games no matter how it happens. So had to put them in at number 9. They're back to a positive record, and overall, this team is much improved from where they were. In at number 8, I've got the Texans. C.J. Stroud has proven week in, week out that he is one of the best rookie sensations we've seen in this league in forever. He's incredible. He's playing really, really good football. Tank Dell and the rest of that receiving core also showing that this offense is much improved. They finally have a run game again with Devin Singletary, which Dameon Pierce could not get going, but Devin Singletary seems to be able to. And their defense is much improved from last year. All in all, this team is a much improved team. They keep winning games, and overall, that's why they're in at number 8. In at number 7, I've got the Jacksonville Jaguars, who actually are taking on the Texans next week, so we'll see who takes the lead of that division. The Jaguars finally had a really complete offensive game after a terrible game against the Niners last week. The Jaguars have a really great offense and defense. They're just inconsistent. Every week it's unclear as to whether Calvin Ridley will show up, whether Christian Kirk will show up on offense, whether Trevor Lawrence is going to have a good game. This team is not consistent on offense, but their defense week in and week out is really good, and therefore they're in at number 7. In at number 6, I've got the Kansas City Chiefs, and they have been the complete opposite of what you would have expected from a Patrick Mahomes-led Chiefs team in recent years. The Chiefs have one of the best defenses in the entire league, but this offense really is struggling. They've scored 0 second-half points in 3 straight weeks, which is just really poor. And the biggest problem is their drops. Their receivers have dropped the most amount of passes of any team in the entire league, and therefore they can't get things done on offense, but their defense is keeping them in games. If they can turn things around, which they should be able to, seeing as Patrick Mahomes is their quarterback, I will put them higher, but for now I can't put them higher than number 6. In at number 5, I've got the Detroit Lions, who have proven that they're a really good football team, but then they lose games terribly like they did to the Ravens. They're losing to bad teams like they were against the Bears, and while they did pull off a win like any good team would, which is why they're still on this list, the fact that they were losing to the Bears, who are a really poor team throughout the entire game, is a really poor sign of what this team can be. I do think the Lions will rebound. However, it was a really poor performance this week. They've had a couple of those in the past couple weeks, including that one, as I said, to the Ravens, and I just can't reasonably put them any higher. In at number 4, I've got the Dallas Cowboys. They continuously prove that they beat up on terrible teams, that they can be one of the best teams in the league, but then they have games like they did against the San Francisco 49ers or like they did against the Cardinals where they lose big or lose to a team they shouldn't. This Cowboys team is really inconsistent, but they time and time again prove that they can beat up on bad teams. They have an incredible defense. Deron Bland has tied the all-time record from pick sixes in a season, and we're only halfway through the season. This Cowboys defense is playing elite. CeeDee Lamb on offense is playing really well. Dak Prescott's playing really well. They're just inconsistent, and therefore I can't put them any higher. In at number 3, I've got the San Francisco 49ers, who have proven that they are back. They had a dominant win over the Jaguars last week. They had a really decisive win this week over the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. The only reason they're down at number 3 is because of that 3-game losing streak, but they have seemed to rebound since. Their defense is much improved since. Their offense seems to be firing again with all their weapons. Brock Purdy had a perfect passer rating, just played an incredible game. And I can't wait to see where this team goes in future weeks, to see them continue to rebound from that terrible 3-game losing streak a couple weeks ago. In at number 2, I've got the Baltimore Ravens. They've taken over as the 1 seed in the AFC. They had a dominant win over the Bengals, and while they did lose Mark Andrews, they have proven that both on offense and defense, they are a complete football team. They keep putting down good teams by a lot, like they did against the Lions and the Seahawks. They keep getting wins. They're stacking wins. They're in first place in their conference. And there's just not much more to be said about them. They're a complete football team. Their defense is one of the best in the entire league. And I can't wait to see how this team can continue to perform in the coming weeks. But in at number 1, we've got the Philadelphia Eagles. They're the number 1 seed in all of football. They have the best record. They've only lost 1 game the entire season, and honestly, it was probably a fluke to the Jets. They just beat the Kansas City Chiefs on prime time to get a Super Bowl rematch victory. And this team is complete on both sides of the ball. Jalen Hurts continues to get those rushing touchdowns with the tush push. A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith making a great duo at receiver. Their run game can't be stopped. Their defense is complete. They have the best rush defense in the league, and their pass defense isn't too far behind. This team is complete. There's not many flaws on this roster, and they keep winning games. They're stacking wins. They're in first for a reason, and therefore the Eagles come in at number 1. Thank you so much for listening this week. I'll catch you guys next week. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Peace.